An Egyptian court has sentenced the head of a journalist union to 2 years in prison, a ruling condemned by rights groups.
Headquarters of the journalist syndicate in central Cairo, referred to as an unprecedented clampdown on media.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. In Egypt, a death sentence has been overturned, but more journalists have been jailed, and the media remain mindful of the red lines. The Netherlands, where journalists are grappling with how to cover the right-wing anti-immigration movement. America's media critic-in-chief, Donald Trump, invites elite journalists to a meeting, then chews them out. And Edward Snowden calls Britain's new surveillance law the most extreme in the history of Western democracy. So where's the news coverage? We begin this program with a media story that used to make international headlines but no longer does. The repression of journalism in Egypt continues virtually unabated, but the coverage of the crackdown has waned. Last week, a court in Cairo sentenced 3 members of the Egyptian press syndicate to 2-year jail terms for having harbored journalists who were on the run from the police. Against a backdrop of numerous jailings of media workers, activists, and human rights advocates, this case is different. Never before has the press syndicate been taken to court by the state. There was another big legal ruling this past week commuting the death sentence of former president and Muslim Brotherhood Party leader Mohamad Morsi. Given how loudly so many mainstream news outlets supported the outlawing of the Muslim Brotherhood, this ruling served as a loyalty test for the Egyptian news media. There are still huge numbers of people behind bars in Egypt, many of them journalists, but their cases have mostly gone unreported, and many of their names are unknown. Our starting point this week is Cairo. The Egyptian press syndicate is more than an organization. In the minds of many citizens, it is a place, a safe one. The building is a short walk from Tahrir Square and is in some ways just as symbolic. A place that the security forces would never breach and had never breached until April of this year, when 2 journalists wanted by the police took shelter there.
The press syndicate has functioned as a kind of safe space for some degree of activism, and a lot of protests have taken place at or right outside on the stairs of the syndicate historically. And the fact that the syndicate's walls were not previously raided by the security apparatus gave protesters a modicum of safety in using the syndicate as a place to gather. Now that that's been violated, this marks a significant escalation in the repression of the press in Egypt.
The press syndicate has a very long history in Egypt. It was during the Nasser years, like with other professions, a syndicate that was really state-controlled. And the turning point was in 1995 when the Mubarak regime tried to pass a repressive media law, and the syndicate played a huge role in opposing this and got the government to make a U-turn. The Sisi regime has tried to rein back this progress and has tried to bring the syndicate and the wider media under its wing, so to speak.
This latest chapter in the syndicate story goes back 6 months, and the pair of reporters the organization sheltered from the security services. The 2 work for a news site called Yanayir and had been charged with spreading false news for their reporting on the El-Sisi government's decision to transfer 2 islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. The transfer of the islands, which came after the Saudis agreed to pump billions of dollars into Egypt's struggling economy, sparked the kinds of demonstrations rarely seen by the Sisi government. 3 senior officials at the syndicate have been jailed for harboring the 2 Yanayir journalists, who have been cleared of the false news charges, the specifics of which were never revealed.
What does it mean to disseminate false news when the government itself is in the business of disseminating false news? It typically means providing, publishing, disseminating any information that goes against the government agenda.
There's a lot of complications in determining who's really got sovereignty over the islands, and certainly people have a right to publish critical views on that. The fact that the syndicate simply allowed those individuals to stay safely within its walls shouldn't be seen as a criminal offense. The state should focus on making its case to the people rather than repressing individuals who want to criticize the decisions being taken.
Mr. Sisi himself defined this action as a criminal action as the government going after an illegal criminal offense and not as one of freedom of speech. By saying we're not going after journalists, journalists are free to express themselves. We are rather going after a criminal offense, which is harboring suspects or fugitives, and the place where they were harbored happened to be the press syndicate.
72 hours after the 3 syndicate officials were sentenced, an appeals court issued another judgment, overturning the death sentence awaiting the former president Mohamad Morsi and ordering a retrial. When Morsi, Egypt's first democratically elected president, was overthrown in 2013, the syndicate chose to remain silent. And the following year, when 3 Al-Jazeera journalists were sentenced to jail terms for allegedly aiding Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, a verdict the U.S. government called chilling and draconian, and the UN described as crushing the media, the syndicate chose its words carefully, saying it did not want to comment on verdicts from the judiciary. Dozens of Egyptian journalists are still behind bars. No one seems to know exactly how many. Among them are writer-researcher Ismail Alexandrani and Mahmoud Abu Zaid, a photographer who calls himself Shakan. 6 months ago, at a court appearance, Shakan and his fellow inmates called out the syndicate for its selective protection of Egyptian journalists. The sign says, "Hey, press syndicate, why is there no support for the 10 of us?"
Mahmoud Abu Zaid's case is very interesting, and it's very tragic in many ways. He's been held without trial for more than 3 years now. We're talking about somebody who was simply taking photographs at the Rabah Square site in Cairo. That was the site of the largest of the state-sponsored massacres that took place after the military coup. So you can understand from the government's perspective why he was a wanted man. They consider whatever was on his camera to be very important evidence against them.
In the case of Mr. Alexandrani, there are 2 issues that bothers the Egyptian government about him. One of them is that he tends to write about Sinai. Sinai is an extremely sensitive area in Egypt right now. There's an Islamist insurgency sympathetic to Islamic State going on. Soldiers and policemen are getting killed and bombed. But also, I think what really bothers the government is that Mr. Alexandrani is a well-known speaker and writer in North America, in Egypt, but also in Western Europe, where he speaks critically about government policies in Sinai and elsewhere.
يجمعه بين تكتيك قوات حرب العصابات وتكتيكات القوات الخاصة، لأن قائد عملياتهم هو المقدم الصاعقة المفصول من الخدمة هشام عشماوي.
I think those were the real reasons why he's in jail.
We've seen other journalists who've had dual, Canadian citizenship or Australian citizenship benefit from that sort of rally, that sort of outcry. But the Egyptian government can more or less do what it wills with Egyptian citizens who don't possess dual citizenship.
A lot of these cases have dragged on for years, and one of the justifications for not actually pursuing the trial is that they can't get a courtroom big enough for the number of defendants being charged, which seems like a kind of ridiculous reason not to proceed. So unfortunately, there's a bit of a Kafkaesque environment when it comes to these trials and how they're pursued, and the inability of the state to follow through with due process in a timely fashion.
Timothy Kaldas talked to us from Cairo via Skype. We contacted many journalists in Egypt for interviews. They chose not to speak. They saw what happened to Ismail Alexandrani after he wrote what he did, what happened to Shakan after he took those pictures, and what happened to dozens more of their colleagues. And now, having seen the leaders of the syndicate jailed after they tried to shelter journalists, they know that in Sisi's Egypt, there are very few safe places left to write, to speak, and almost nowhere left to hide. On the download now, our viewers on the state of journalism in Egypt.
A lot of dissidents and journalists have been jailed without any trial. And the way in which the government can get away with it is by saying that they have electoral mandate for it. As we know, in any democratic system, you also need minority rights and right to dissent without fear, and that does not exist in Egypt.
The Egyptian regime has been extremely successful in its use of violence and repression against its opponents. Its success is basically lying on two different dimensions. It was able to sell itself as a bulwark against extremism. It was able to use its massive media empire to revive extreme chauvinistic nationalism, which justified repression and placed all opposition activities in light of sabotage, espionage, or conspiring with foreign powers.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump summoned American television executives and news anchors to a meeting in New York this past week in what could have been a chance to clear the air after a contentious election campaign. According to multiple accounts, though, it did not go well. Among those invited for what turned out to be a dressing down were executives and anchor talent from ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox News, and CNN. The whole thing was supposed to be off the record, an agreement the journalists promptly broke. Trump reportedly began the session by berating his guests for their unfair and dishonest coverage of the campaign. He singled out two networks in particular, CNN and NBC. Trump and CNN's president, Jeff Zucker, go way back to 2004. Zucker was with NBC when he gave Trump his own reality show, The Apprentice.
You're fired.
According to the New York Post, Trump turned on Zucker. "I hate your network," he reportedly said. "Everyone at CNN is a liar, and you should be ashamed." Despite all the reports, one of which described the meeting as like a firing squad, Trump's media advisor, Kellyanne Conway, said it was very cordial, very genial, but it was very candid and honest. It's great to hit the reset button. Just 2 days after the U.S. election, CEO Mark Zuckerberg said the notion that Facebook helped tip the election in Trump's favor by unwittingly allowing fake news to spread across its platform was, quote, pretty crazy. Now he's been forced to acknowledge that the company should be doing more. Zuckerberg posted that Facebook is in the process of introducing stronger verification of news stories, as well as warning labels for content that has been flagged as fake. But he says the problems are complex, both technically and philosophically. And he said he did not want Facebook, which has grown into a hugely influential news platform, to become an arbiter of truth. Meanwhile, President Barack Obama has described the new online media ecosystem as a place where everything is true and nothing is true. Yemen has become one of the most dangerous places in the world to work as a journalist, and now another one has just disappeared. Yusuf Ajlan is a former editor at Al-Masdar Online. Colleagues from Al-Masdar say he was taken from his home by Houthi militiamen last month in the capital Sana'a and has not been heard from since. It's not the first time that Al-Masdar, an independent news outlet, has been targeted. Al-Masdar's offices were raided last year. Its website has been censored. It was also harassed by the former government when President Saleh was in power. According to the Yemeni journalist Syndicate, Yusuf Ajlan's disappearance brings the total number of journalists abducted in Yemen this year to 16. On our last program, we reported on the German news media and some of the criticisms that they've been hearing over their coverage of immigration issues in particular and the political right in general. This week, we turn our attention to the Netherlands, where for the past 10 years, the far-right Freedom Party has moved from the political wilderness to where it is today, leading in the polls with an election coming up next year. The party's leader, Geert Wilders, has long argued that the Dutch mainstream news media cover populist movements on the right with mockery and cynicism. Many Dutch media consumers have come to share that view and have started to go elsewhere for their political news. Alternative right-wing news outlets such as Geen Stel and Pownet have grown more popular and have now found a platform on Dutch state-funded television channels where their anti-Islam, anti-immigration rhetoric can reach far larger audiences. The Listening Post's Johanna Hoesnau from Amsterdam on the dilemma facing Dutch mainstream journalism and how the rise of the far right is forcing a change in the country's news media.
At an election rally in 2014, far-right politician Geert Wilders asked supporters of his party, de Partij voor de Vrijheid, de PVV, this question.
In deze stad en in Nederland, meer of minder Marokkanen? Minder, 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 minder.
Wilders ended up in court for that, charged with inciting hatred against immigrants. He faces a possible fine of €5,000 and a verdict is expected soon. Wilders has accused the courts of trying to silence him, and he's been saying the same about the Dutch mainstream media for years.
The tone with which these parties were covered and these politicians and these social movements has been one of slight ridicule. So almost as if the party or the politicians were not really taken seriously.
U zegt Geert Wilders moet een kans krijgen. Kijk, laten we wel wezen, in Den Haag, en dat ken ik goed genoeg, wordt nu al gezegd, hoe groot Geert Wilders ook wordt, regeren gaat hij niet.
Je zou kunnen zeggen traditioneel links of progressief.
You could say that the traditionally left progressive media until this point have only engaged with far-right movements by opposing them, by discarding them, by saying people are bad or stupid for holding such beliefs. This has only been counterproductive, because by repressing this sentiment, you end up radicalizing the debate. Yet for 15 years, politicians and the media have failed to offer an alternative that goes beyond merely denying those sentiments that you don't agree with.
Van het geluid waar ze het niet mee eens zijn.
The far right has been on the rise in Holland since 2002, when the politician widely considered the father of the far-right movement in Europe, Pim Fortuyn, was shot dead for his anti-Islam rhetoric. Feeling the mainstream media no longer catered to their views, a part of the Dutch audience started looking elsewhere for their media coverage. Since 2003, online outlet Geen Stijl, No Style, has offered such an alternative. While the platform claims to have no political sympathies, for the left or the right, its rhetoric often reflects the PVV's far-right positions, particularly on immigration and Islam. The harsh language used by Geen Stijl is often racist and sexist. Former contributor Annabel Nanninga says the website is simply covering what the mainstream media won't.
There is a whole landscape of representation, of opinion, of facts that was completely left barren by, let's say, old media. The mistake the old media made was to underestimate the power, perhaps, that Fortuyn and Wilders had to mobilize this huge sense of not belonging anymore, of estrangement, of alienation. A lot of people in this country were starting to feel.
Geen Stijl is now precies.
Geen Stijl is a perfect example of a weblog, a website that was born from the idea that the voice of the common public must be heard, and it was a slamming success. But what they didn't do is practice journalism in the way that it was taught to us, that is, following principles of fair, balanced and impartial reporting. Some people call what they do journalism. I'm sorry, but it's not.
Het spijt me, dat is het niet.
By 2010, Geen Stijl had grown into such a significant outlet that it found a second home on the airwaves. The Dutch Public Broadcasting Service, the NPO, is unique in that it gives airtime to any broadcaster that can make the case that it serves a distinct segment of the Dutch population. Geen Stijl's broadcast arm, Pownet, now airs a weekly 30-minute newscast. It's the most far-right voice that can be heard on the Dutch public channels today.
The mainstream media and the majority of our public service broadcasters are very politically correct. They value respectability and decency over reflecting people's opinions. Our approach, however, is to let the people feel they are being heard. And taking that into account, I think that it's very important that Pownet is a part of public service broadcasting. Should we always be tolerant, or should we tell it as it is for a change?
Is het islam er ook gewoon, is gewoon bedoeld, zomaar zeggen, om te zorgen dat anderen, wat anderen geloven en wat andere mensen denken, de waarden die andere mensen hebben, om die te vernietigen.
Pownet and Geen Stijl are at the vanguard of the far-right media movement here in the Netherlands. They have been characterized by many in the Dutch mainstream media as being divisive and extreme, and have been accused of pushing many rank falsehoods online. But the commentators at Pownet and Geen Stijl aren't exactly shy about their opinions either. They say that on the threat of immigration and Islam, the Dutch mainstream media is weak, apologist and fundamentally untruthful.
What you see in the media is a coverage of immigration and Islam that is one-sided, to say the least, and thereby they are alienating a lot of their readers and viewers.
Maar die mensen hebben rechten en ze weten het soms niet. Die worden beschouwd als criminelen, maar zijn slachtoffers.
You know, there's, for example, a terrorist attack, and the commentaries will always be, oh, that has nothing to do with true Islam. and people just don't buy it anymore.
So there is a general sense that the institutions don't work for most people anymore, but only for some people. And it's a very powerful frustration. Now, you can see that Pownet and several other shows that have been developed since cater to that specific market as well.
Het is de praktijk dat schaarse dingen zoals zorg, woningen, geld worden verdeeld aan mensen die nieuw worden binnengehaald, terwijl we voor de mensen die er al zijn niet kunnen zorgen.
Pownet and Geen Stijl have ensured that populist language, previously reserved for the far right, is no longer limited to that world. Words like ploflim, exploding Muslim, and dobberneger, floating Negro, invented by Geen Stijl, have become common, igniting a debate on the limits of free speech.
Ik denk dat het laatste...
I think that the last thing you should question is free speech. What is happening, though, is a normalization of things that were thought to be unacceptable in the past, because they were rude or even racist. But now, facts aren't that important anymore. Opinions are. There is a push to create a climate where everybody can say anything, and I think that's a slippery slope.
En dan het vlak.
For years it was absolutely unheard of to say, I think there are too many Muslims in this country, for example. And then those new media came, and they said it anyway.
Het is niet zo heel moeilijk om verhaaltjes aan te praten, hè? Want het is nogal verrotte ideologie. Dus je kunt het zo aanwijzen wat er allemaal niet aan deugt.
And there was nothing nobody could do about it. And everybody liked it, and a lot of people agreed with it.
A few days after Donald Trump won the elections in the United States, Shula Rijksman, chairwoman of the Dutch public broadcaster, wrote a letter of apology in a Dutch newspaper, the Volkskrant. She promised that the NPO, which has been criticized for pushing and promoting leftist politics, would actively push to give all Dutch people a voice.
De vele stemmen van deze samenleving laten horen.
Now coverage is more directed to let's go to the street and see what's really happening. So you have journalists actually telling each other, we should maybe spend more time like figuring out what's really going on, which is interesting to hear that journalists saying, because isn't that their job all along?
De belangrijkste tekortkoming van nieuwsmedia.
The most significant shortcoming of the news media is that they cover news pegs, never long-term structures. As a result, they fail to recognize what is really going on in society. After a big event like the financial crisis or the election of Trump, journalists ask themselves why they didn't see it coming. They explain it by pointing fingers at the bad guys. Who that bad guy is always depends on political sympathies. Geen Stijl blames Muslims. Left-wing media blames racist populists, all of which is counterproductive. The media should identify structural causes to provide structural solutions. In other words, we should redefine what classifies as news. People's daily reality. That is what should become newsworthy.
Tot nieuwsverheffing.
And finally, we end the broadcast roughly where we started it, with a story that news junkies say has not received the attention it deserves. Last week, the Investigatory Powers Act, better known as the Snoopers Charter, was passed into law by the British government. The bill legalizes a brand new range of online tools for the government and its security forces to monitor citizens' communications. Watching all of this from Moscow and summing up a very complex story in fewer than 140 characters, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden said the UK has just legalized the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. It goes further than many autocracies. Despite the sweeping powers contained in the new law, it was passed with barely a whimper from the British opposition parties, and the mainstream news media in the UK went so light on the story that a lot of people felt compelled to jump online to give it the kind of exposure they say it needs. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.